Horror films have garnered a somewhat negative reputation. The films that are most often associated with the genre are the ones that rely on sex, gore, and one-dimensional character. And while these films have a place in horror, they do not reflect the genre as a whole. The defining horror films that make the genre what it is today try to do one simple thing: scare you. These defining films preyed on the things that kept us up at night. While the films themselves were not simple, the basic ideas were. An escaped mental patient targets 3 teenage girls in a small suburban town on Halloween.
Oh, look.
Look where?
Behind the bush.
I don't see anything.
The guy who drove by so fast, that one you yelled at.
Subtle, isn't he?
You fall victim to a killer who creates your nightmares and keeps you from ever waking up. Your family is moved into an isolated, haunted hotel, and your father is driven slowly mad.
Here's Johnny.
One of your classmates has seen one too many horror movies and begins picking off your friends one by one. I'm going to look at how 3 horror films defined and redefined the horror genre, through the lens of cinematography, sound, and genre breaking. First, John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween, through the lens of cinematography. It would be difficult to discuss this film without talking about its use of the Steadicam, particularly in the opening sequence.
We are alone, aren't we?
Michael's around someplace. Take off that thing.
Let's go upstairs.
Okay.
The sequence was filmed almost entirely in one take, aside from the quick cut when the mask is placed over the camera. The effect of shooting a large portion of the film through the eyes of Michael Myers is that the viewer never knows what he is doing or when the action will hit. John Carpenter had this entire scene mapped out in his head, so there was no need to storyboard it, which is fairly uncommon in present day. One theorist we discussed this semester, Gene Epstein, went in depth on cinematography. Through this quote, Epstein seems to say that through the way in which films are shot, a reality we are unfamiliar to is presented to us. This is especially helpful for horror because the element of unfamiliarity is what keeps the viewer on edge. In Halloween, even if it was something as simple as a tree branch, there was always something lurking in the shot to keep the viewer anxious. The unwavering suspense, coupled with the score, are a couple reasons why the film is still relevant today. While horror movie scores got a lot of recognition in the 1970s and 80s, they are still very important today. That brings me to the next film I'm going to discuss, Brian Bertino's 2008 debut, The Strangers. The Strangers follows a couple coming home from a friend's wedding reception after the man, James, has proposed to his girlfriend, Kristen, and she says no. The house is set up for a yes, so it's very uncomfortable from the get-go. The film doesn't go over the top with the characters, and they come across as people you could easily know. Soon after, three masked villains begin to terrorize them for reasons unbeknownst to the audience. There are three elements of sound in this film that help build the narrative. The first is the score itself, the second is the soundtrack, and the third is the sound effects the strangers use to make their presence known. As with most films, the score is a character in itself. In a way, the score is the replacement for the stranger's dialogue. It builds as they near, never completely going quiet. It is not over the top, and it matches the quiet atmosphere of the film. Another critic we discussed this semester that explores sound was Michelle Chion. The argument here is that hearing is primal. It was even compared to an infant hearing the sounds of its mother in the womb. An element that was defined was the acousmatic, which is the sound that is heard without its cause or source being seen. This works for both the off-camera sound effects and the score. Chion also described acousmature as being the presence that haunts at the film's edges that isn't seen. The strangers do exactly this for the first part of the film, up until they make their intentions known. The strangers have very little dialogue, and when it is used, it is absolutely terrifying. For example,
Why are you doing this to us? Because you were home.
the sound effects in The Strangers top off the narrative. The interior shots were filmed in a giant empty warehouse with just the set and the actress present. Every knock, subtle noise like the wind chimes, bang, scream, or gunshot echoed much longer than it would have normally. This choice made every sound an explosion, making the viewer even more on edge. Finally, the soundtrack is used brilliantly to also add suspense. Often in horror films, songs with lyrics are only used before the action starts, and the score is the main source of suspense. In this film, that is not the case. All of the songs used prior to the main action are eerie as fuck, but the main soundtrack element comes from a broken record that begins skipping at the exact moment the film hits the point of no return. The effect of the skipping song mimics that of rapid breathing or a rapid heartbeat, which are both things the leading lady is experiencing. The Strangers is in the vein of Halloween in that it is more of a terror film than a horror film. It relies on subtlety and suspense, to the point where the viewer is begging for something to happen to alleviate the tension. Finally, another element of film is the genre it is a part of. In terms of turning the genre on its head, Scream is the film that achieved this most successfully. It redefined what horror could be. Critic Thomas Schatz discusses how genre essentially gets recycled in new ways. This quote essentially sums up what Scream did, but it did it in a very revolutionary way. The film has genre elements: a small town, people start to get murdered, and it becomes cat and mouse, with the cops being no help whatsoever. The difference is, the teenagers are aware of the horror tropes. What to do to stay alive, what not to do, they cover all of them. This film is a satire on the genre, yet it is also a horror film. It plays with sequels never living up to the original, yet it spawned 3 of its own. It also works as a horror film due to its director, the late Wes Craven, labeled by many as the master of the genre. While this film has plenty of horror tropes, that is kind of the point. It's more of a commentary on horror than anything else. And this essentially makes it one of the best horror franchises.
It's because there's no way a girl could have killed him.
That is so sexist. The killer could easily be female. Basic instinct.
That was an ice pick. Not exactly the same thing. Yeah, Casey and Steve were completely hollowed out. And the fact is, it takes a man to do something like that.
Or a man's mentality.
How do you gut someone?
You take a knife, and you slit him from groin to sternum.
Hey, it's called tact, you fuck rag.
Horror is a lot more than sex, blood, and weak storylines. When it is done right, it deserves as much respect as any other genre.